In the hush between breath and silence, there lingers a question that every civilization has whispered to itself. What happens after the final heartbeat fades? The ancient Greeks asked this question not with fear alone, but with an artistry of imagination that turned death into a continuation of poetry itself. Tonight, under the soft glow of your room and the slow turning of another hour, we'll drift into that world, the world where souls crossed rivers, where gods ruled quiet kingdoms beneath the earth, and where the living spoke to the dead through ritual, song, and the light of small trembling lamps. To the Greeks, death was not an ending, but a change of address. Life's final breath, they believed, was only the beginning of a longer journey, a passage to a land ruled by Hades and Persephone, where the air itself shimmered with memory. In their myths, the soul slipped free, like a bird released from the body, guided by Hermes, the gentle messenger, to the shadowed shores of the underworld. There a ferryman named Charon waited beside the river Styx, his oar steady as time, his eyes reflecting the moonlight of two worlds. A single coin placed under the tongue paid the fare, and without it, the spirit wandered, searching for passage. Imagine that, a single coin deciding whether you cross or linger. And yet, this realm of the dead was not always grim. Some imagined vast meadows of asphodel, soft and grey, where the departed strolled in the half-light, still dreaming of their lives. Others told of Elysium, the Elysian fields, where the most just and noble souls found endless springtime, music, and laughter that never grew old. The poet said that heroes who had lived bravely, who had remembered the gods and honoured the bonds of friendship, might even be reborn, rising again to walk beneath the sun. But for all its beauty and mystery, the Greek afterlife was a reflection of their deepest question. What does it mean to live well? In their vision of the underworld, the echo of each deed continued. Even in the silence of death, the moral fabric of life still spoke. Philosophers like Plato and Pindar pondered this endlessly, wondering if the afterlife was a mirror where the soul sees its truest self. The myths were not just stories. They were meditations on memory, justice, and the delicate tether between mortality and meaning. As you listen tonight, I invite you to drift with me into that twilight space where myth and philosophy meet. We will follow the footsteps of those who believed the dead could still hear the living's prayers, who left small offerings, oil, wine, and honey, to keep a bridge open between both worlds. We'll walk the quiet roads of Eleusis, where initiates once whispered secrets about life, death, and rebirth. We'll stand beside the ancient fires where people prayed not for immortality, but for remembrance. Perhaps somewhere deep down, these old beliefs still breathe in us. The idea that love continues after the heart has stopped, that kindness echoes in places we cannot see, that the end is not an end at all, but a returning home through a doorway the living cannot yet pass. So settle in, let the lights grow dim, let the voices of the past come close. In the story of the Greek afterlife, there is no rush, no fear, only the slow rhythm of time, the hush of oars on dark water, and the quiet certainty that every soul sooner or later finds its way across. And maybe, just maybe, by listening to these ancient beliefs, we'll learn something about how to live, so that when our own night comes, we'll know how to walk through it gently. You are listening to the entire history. Stay with me, and together we'll cross the threshold the Greeks once dreamed of, one whisper, one heartbeat, one story at a time. He had heard it named in 100 ways along peninsulas and islands. Hades, the house of many, the below-ground country where roots drink and shadows practice patience. And in the hush between oar strokes, some fishermen would murmur it to the water, as if the sea could carry replies. In bright town squares it slipped into a potter's border, a white figure stepping toward a small black boat. And in winter, while olives were pressed and the hills breathed crushed leaves, old women tied the same tale into their shawls, that the final breath leaving the lips was not lost but gathered, the psyche, a moth-bright soul, lifting from warm bread into cool air. In the earliest Greek songs, the afterlife was not prize or penalty, but a dim continuance, Homer's shades, fine as dream silk, clustering in asphodel, where memory thinned, like letters, worn by centuries of feet. Even heroes, city-benders, felt the dullness, and one, meeting a friend again, wept to learn how the page of glory pales in that grey pasture. Yet from those first verses, one hears the weight given to right, the coin at tongue or eyes, so Charon would ferry, the careful washing, the oil and honey, the lock of hair, the terracotta Phlegethon set like a small lamp to tell the dark not to hurry. Hermes, in his quieter office, Psychopompos, was said to walk the dead to the riverbank, brisk as dawn wind, yet courteous, a host escorting a guest who would be long away. And the lord below, no devil, but a sovereign of order, kept the keys with the calm of one who knows every door yields in time. Persephone was the earth's rhythm itself. 6 seeds counted on winter's fingers, and then the loosening, fields breathed by her calendar, and mothers too, learning the afterlife not only as locale, but as pattern of going and returning that plants and daughters understand. Across generations the picture grew richer, if not clearer. Some envisioned a triple fork, where judges on the edge of evening weighed what a life had loved. Some set apart Tartarus deep and iron-ribbed for titans and those whose deeds warped the common world. Others saved a shore called Elysium, a meadow remembered from childhood, where air never tired you and music did not end so much as find an easier step. They believed in gates, thresholds that trained courtesy. The living must ask before approaching the region of the dead, and the dead must be invited to the living's table with care, hence dusk libations, names whispered on appointed nights, a chair left empty though, in another accounting, full. Archaeologists, dusting small bones, have found quiet proofs of such habits, mouth coins bright as captive moons, black figure craters showing the ferry, one oar dipping, one hand extended in the universal come, and on steles, the tender grammar of parting, fingertips merely touching, not clasping, as if the sculptor meant to honour the respect owed to farewell. And still, the Greeks did not all agree, not always, not valley to valley. Their world was a chorus, never a single voice. In Orphic circles, pockets of song and hope, another promise stirred, that the soul weary of the wheel might step aside if it kept the passwords of purity, if it remembered to tell the stewards, I am a child of earth and starry sky, and to choose the cool spring on the right rather than the forgetful one on the left. Thin gold tablets, sunlight folded for the road, were slipped beside the dead to coach their first words in a land where remembering was its own rescue. Pythagoreans spoke of return, lives like reeds in a pipe played more than once, each turn a variation on the old melody. Later, philosophers offered weights and measures, the just soul lighter, the unjust heavier, while others, sterner or simply practical, insisted that whatever hope one kept for later, funerary nobility was for now. It bound the living to gratitude and taught a city. It was not accident, but a chain of debts tenderly paid. What stays constant is the courtesy at the threshold. Death carried miasma, a dust of unclean asking for washing and incense and fire along the perimeter. But this was less fear than respect, the way voices lower when crossing a temple's noon shade. Children learned that names endure. Speak them, and you feed them, and on certain days, the dead were invited home with cakes shaped like ladders, as if to help a shade find a window. Elsewhere, mothers traced a circle in ash, keeping absence tidy so it would not ransack the house with grief. Historians still argue what was belief and what was beautiful habit. The pottery says one thing, the poems another, the philosophers a third. Perhaps the truth is that a people who loved form gave even their uncertainty a vessel, lined its lip with black glaze, and drank carefully. So their afterlife was less an answer than a climate. Rivers, speaking low enough to sleep by, a door watched by a patient dog, a garden rising each year from a queen's remembered steps, a field where the best memories were stored like grain, and beyond it, the unlit parcel where mystery keeps quiet. Close your eyes and listen for the oar's scratch. One measured stroke, then another, someone ferrying not reward or reproof, but passage itself. And on the far bank, a shape like your own, lighter than breath, waiting for the password once pinned to a tunic before burial began. Somewhere above, in daylight, a coin glints in a dish, ready for the next crossing, ready for the next telling, and not far off, a winter seed counts softly to 6. He was not a priest, and never needed to be. Like anyone raised, where goats worry time, on stony hills, and the sea keeps its private clock, he had learned the quiet agreements between living and dead, the way a child learns a path, heel in the soft print, left the day before. When a neighbour's breath thinned and the house drew its shutters like eyelids, people arrived, not with arguments, but with water and oil. They washed the body slowly, reminding each limb of its former belonging, combed the hair with a care that asked for nothing back. Laurel freshened the doorway, and the funeral couch faced the street so passers-by could lend their eyes, because grief, the Greeks understood, keeps steadier time when watched by more than one gaze. A coin, no matter its metal, always cool, was set to the mouth as a small round promise, and sometimes myrtle was tucked by the fingers to sweeten the first steps of the journey. Outside, a woman keened a high thread that briefly tuned the city to her pitch. Men traced the route in thought, past the stoa, across the market where talk would have to fold itself quiet, out the gate that looks toward fields, already thinking of harvest. At dawn, before heat gathered, they set out with the beer, garlands trailing soft punctuation on the dust. A friend walked ahead, a small flame cupped between his palms to teach the breeze its manners, and children behind counted steps, as if counting could be its own lamp. People would say later that Hermes walked with them, one of his mildest officers, keeping time as messengers do, never hurrying, never letting delay sprawl, and the dogs in doorways, who know more than they say, watched with sober courtesy, as though recognizing the leash that leads all creatures back to return. At the pyre, wood spoke, in crackles grammar, and libation stitched the air with bright, thin threads. A sun crushed a leaf between thumb and forefinger, breathed it, let the pinch fall onto the fire, and for a beat the smoke behaved like a letter being folded and handed to someone just out of sight. Ashes were gathered as if every grain had a name, and placed in a vessel shaped like a patient thought. When the jar was sealed, it wore a clay ribbon, once turned by a wetted hand. And the hand remembered, and the jar remembered, and the city, still arguing about grain prices and treaties, remembered too. They set the vessel into earth with small deliberate tools, not to entomb, but to plant. If the dead are seeds in any sense, the Greeks preferred to think they sprout as story and duty, and those quiet corrections to the spine when one passes a shrine. On the marking stone, a sculptor carved the scene he could almost make with his eyes closed. Two figures at a doorway made of air, fingers nearly touching but not quite. Not tragedy, but manners. Leave-taking shown as a fine form of love. Some evenings later, when light went long and gold across the courtyards, the family set out small cups and a morsel of cake, not because anyone expected footsteps on the stair, but because hospitality is a language the dead taught first, and the living must keep speaking. In time, the festivals lifted private gestures into public shape. At the Genesia, graves were tidied and the town's memory combed smooth. At the Anthesteria, when jars were opened and wine remembered its road back into laughter, doors were smeared with pitch and hawthorn hung to ask the visiting dead to be gentle. And at the end a phrase, "Out you go, Keres," sent them kindly on their way, like guests seen to the gate, with thanks and a final glance. Scholars still debate how literal the Greeks were, how far belief reached into the marrow, but anyone who has sat at a village table knows literal is the wrong measure. What matters is rhythm, the choreography by which a people agree to say the unsayable together, softly with bread on the board and a lamp-bearing witness. He, the watcher on the hill, who was not a priest, kept a thin gold idea folded in his mind, the way some keep a coin for luck, that the road below the earth is braided, not straight, with lanes for forgetting and lanes for remembering, that a soul must be taught like a new apprentice at the kiln which handle to grasp and when. An old woman had told him, "When your time comes, do not drink from any spring until you've asked its name. No magic, only prudence. And if a path invites you downward too fast, smile and let it pass." These counsels sounded like lullabies, and perhaps they were. The afterlife here was not a threat, but a tempo, something the pulse recognizes even in sleep. And if listening now, you feel the room loosen, and the minutes untie their knots, know that people on these coasts have listened this way for thousands of years. If you're still gently awake, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time your night reads. And if this calms you, consider subscribing to the entire history so we can keep walking these lamplit roads together. For now, let the procession thin into dusk, the last garland giving its scent back to the air, and see beyond the city gate another gathering, torches along a long road to a sacred field, a queen returning by steps counted in seeds, and a quiet password waiting on a tablet of gold, as the path bends, almost imperceptibly, toward a mystery lit from within. Between the olive terraces and the small temples, keeping watch at the crossroads, a gentler map lay across the countryside, not drawn in ink, but in habits, in the choreography of hands that remembered how to move when the hour asked for reverence. He learned it as others did, fetching water at dawn and noticing how elders poured a few drops aside, carrying bread home in a folded cloth and seeing his mother break the first piece for those who could no longer sit at the table. In this map, the borders were seasons, the guideposts were stories spoken low enough to travel inside a single breath. The year wore a rhythm. After harvest, when fields exhaled and stubble shone like tired gold, voices turned toward the queen beneath, toward the weeks when roots rule and husks teach patience. Lamps were set in niches, with the tenderness usually reserved for infants, and the thin smoke of myrrh stitched doors and windows together as if the house were being re-sewn for winter. He did not think in doctrines, he thought in tasks. Sweep the threshold, wash the jar, speak the name. At the well he heard rumours that old beliefs were changing, that philosophers were teaching the soul to argue for its own brightness, that Orphic songs promised a lane of release where memory, far from burden, could be a boat. Yet even those new promises arrived, wearing old courtesies, gold lamellae folded small enough to rest by the tongue, passwords asking for the cool spring on the right, a careful difference kept between the plea to forget and the harder, braver art of remembering. Winter evenings gathered people into rooms the size of a held breath. A lyre would be tuned until its notes found the grain of the wooden wall. Then, an elder, exact rather than austere, spoke of pathways and traced them in the air. Here the asphodel plain, he said, where lives blur into gentle sameness. Here Tartarus, deeper than thought can fall, where titans who taught the world to fear its own strength are bound. Here Elysium, a meadow of unspent morning. The young listened like oars finding a coxswain's cadence. Questions rose and nested along the rafters. If a man practiced justice without the words for it, where would he walk? If a bitter enemy were given a cup and asked to drink, what would the cup remember? The elders smiled. The stories refused to become law. They preferred to be weather, arriving, lingering, softening stone. And there was always the river, sometimes Lethe, whose name sands the edges off grief, sometimes Mnemosyne, bright as a winter star, reminding that to carry the weight of what one has been is also a form of grace. He walked home thinking of those waters, how often the living sip forgetting without noticing, how rare the days when memory is taken like medicine, bitter, precise, and healing in its slowness. At graves the city's patience became visible. He read the carved scenes as a primer for the living, hands nearly touching, a girl with a basket of fruit at a doorway of air, a seated figure turning her head at the exact angle that says, "I hear you," without pretending to answer. He noticed the dog, the stone cutters, always placed, never snarling, always watchful, a keeper of thresholds rather than a threat. With a fingertip, he traced the simple hair, farewell, and also rejoice, and wondered if both meanings drink from the same cup. When the antisteria returned and the jars were opened, laughter moved through the streets with the sudden ease of birds slipping a once-bolted gate. Yet even then hawthorn sprigs hung, pitch-darkened lintels, and at evening the gentle dismissal was spoken, kindly out, kindly out. It was no contradiction. It was the grammar of hosting, the city reminding itself that love keeps manners. Sometimes, on errands that took him past the harbour, he paused at a potter's stall, over a painted crater, a small boat, an old oarsman, a passenger with the universal face of uncertainty. "See the oar mid-stroke," the potter said in the patient tempo clay teaches, and the hand that is both gesture and question. He bought nothing, yet carried the scene away like a quiet lamp. Nights lengthened, stars chose their stations and kept them until rain. Lying awake, he thought of Persephone counting to 6 in the deep rooms, each seed a soft drum within the earth, and of Demeter above teaching mortals to sow with a patience that includes absence as part of growth. He pictured Hermes, hat tilted, eyes bright with errands, pausing at a farm gate to hear a household whisper thanks. If you're listening now, let the same rhythm breathe in your room. A pause between words, a small libation of silence poured onto the floor of the mind. And because we're travelling together along this lamplit path, I'm curious, where are you listening from? And what time has your night reached? If this gentle road keeps you company, consider subscribing to the entire history so we can meet again when lamps are low and the world is ready to remember. As if in answer, wind worried the laurel leaves and the dark gave a soft returned sound. Somewhere beyond town, in a grove where footsteps arrive with their own hush, a door not made by hand stood slightly ajar, and on the far side a river practiced saying its name. In the cool before dawn, when rooftops hover in a colour not quite blue and not quite grey, he walked the long road toward a sanctuary where wheat learned its secret from a grieving mother. The flagstones underfoot held a drowsy warmth, as if each had been a pillow for centuries of pilgrims who came not begging triumph or coin, but gentler news about the dark. Eleusis, the elders called it, a place where descent and return were not only recited, but rehearsed with the body, where feet remembered a choreography older than the tongue, a procession kept like a vow, a silence guarded like a lamp cupped in two careful hands. He had heard the rumours that those who entered and were shown certain things, never written, barely spoken, came out altered in a way no court could measure, as though the heart had learned the difference between a locked door and a merely closed one. In that painted dusk of memory, someone named the judges, Minos steady with balance, Rhadamanthes, whose fairness cooled like water, Iacchus stern yet tidy, and spoke of a weighing that tested not deeds alone but attachments, whether a life clutched what could not be kept or opened its fingers when it was time. He liked that, the afterlife as a quiet exam in the art of letting go. Near the sacred precinct, a storyteller recalled the king who went down alive, the one we call Odysseus, pouring black blood into a trench and discovering that memory can be crowded by the wishes of the dead. Another told of a musician, quick-footed with grief, who nearly unhooked a life from absence and then, turning too soon, taught the world that trust is not only a virtue but an art. These were not threats, he felt, but lessons that entered the body the way dawn enters a room. At the edges first, then the eyes, and only later the mind. Philosophers offered their torches too. One, patient as a teacher of letters, argued that the soul is misled by shadows and must be trained to love what is real even when the real feels abstract as a theorem. Another, more practical, said the proof of any doctrine lives in the dignity of its funerals, the tidy jar, the shared bread, the speaking of names, rather than in any diagram of the sky. The city absorbed both like a field takes weather, sun and rain, argument and lullaby, until what remained was a temperate wisdom. Behave so that you're leaving mirrors, you're living, and see to it that when the hour arrives, someone can find the coin. He remembered the small gold tablets found in distant graves. I am a child of earth and starry sky. It sounded like a password, yes, but also like a confession of tenderness, an admission that a human belongs to clay and constellations both, and must therefore practice humility and reach. Somewhere a strict priest muttered of Tartarus, its iron geography for souls who bend the common order into pain. Somewhere an old aunt, grinding grain in a rhythm like rain, said simply that people tend the dead so the living don't break. He believed both, a little. He had begun to notice how easily the living drink Lethe without naming it, a small cruelty allowed to fade, a promise conveniently blurred, and how rarely they bow to manimosity and take sip by steady sip the sharp tonic of accountability. Perhaps, he thought, the rites were practiced for those waters, learning when forgetting is merciful and when remembering is brave, so that when the ferry noses in, one knows which jar to lift. That night at Eleusis, torches traced soft commas in the dark and paused the sentence of the road. Faces moved like constellations gently rearranged by walking. There were pockets of laughter, small and surprised, and stretches of reverent quiet where even sandals learned to whisper. Someone behind him breathed a prayer with no words. Someone ahead sang a fragment whose melody felt familiar, like a lullaby overheard in infancy and recovered long after in a different house. He followed the line, knowing nothing about what would be shown, only that a heart steadied by belonging can learn to meet a threshold without flinching. If you are still with him in this blue hour, let your room borrow the same pace, slow as a gate closing thoughtfully, open as a field after rain. And I'm quietly curious. Where are you listening from? And what time has your night reached? If these old pathways keep you company, consider subscribing to the entire history so we can return to them together, lamp by lamp, seed by seed, until distances begin to feel like kin. He paused in the outer court and looked back. The town lay simple, a geometry of roofs and lanes with the patient hinge of the sky above. Ahead, a door waited. No threat, only a line of shadow like a breath held before speaking. Somewhere below, a river rehearsed its syllables. Somewhere above, a few stars remembered his name, just enough to keep it warm. And in the space between, where mortals live and learn, an unseen hand touched wick to flame, and the fire stood up, ready as if it had been listening all along. Toward the season, when swallows begin rehearsing their returns and mornings wear a hush like folded linen, he noticed that the border between here and below was not a hard line, but a fine woven fabric, strong, yes, yet willing to breathe. Dreams slipped through like quicksilver, and the living, with the village sense they trust for weather and bread, learned to read what washed ashore. A sailor home from the Ionian routes told of a night near a river whose name elders speak softly, Acheron, when fog arranged itself into rooms and a low murmur seemed to edit the water's thought. A plain man, not given to marvels, he said only that he felt looked after as if some debt had been tallied and forgiven. Another spoke of the inland necromantian, not a theatre of fright, but a disciplined place where petitioners trained their grief into a single lucid question by abstinence and exact rite. He would not say whether an answer came, only that he left level, as if a mason had set the spirit true. Even philosophers, carpenters of thought, kept a small truce at the subject's edge. One would diagram the soul's ascent like constellations chalked on slate. Another would shrug and say all proofs must be lived in the grain of a careful funeral. The wash body, the coin cool as moon on the tongue, the name spoken without hurry. He carried these accounts like a charm, unflaunted, near the skin. In his own house, ordinary gestures set the pace. Each dusk he touched the lintel twice, once for those within, once for the listening beyond. He kept a small dish on the sill with a coin that was never spent, so the idea of passage would never be a stranger. He made a habit of mending small breaks, a cracked cup, a frayed strap, as practice for the gentler work on the far bank, where remembering and repair may be the same craft. In the agora, a potter lifted a fresh lekythos to the light. Hermes barefoot, hat-tipped, guiding a shade with a hand that accompanied rather than compelled. "Leave a little room in the gesture," the potter said, smoothing a line with a wetted thumb, "so both figures can still choose." He liked that, an ethics of space, taught in clay. News from the west added other colours to the map. Whispers of the Isles of the Blessed where wind unlearns harshness and voices never tire. Nearer home, Orphic pockets tending gold, lamellae, like seeds trusting that a soul, properly tutored, might step aside from the wheel and rest in a clearer meadow. Yet in practical houses, bread was broken, graves were swept, and dogs were greeted at doorways as colleagues of a threshold no one wise would mock. He smiled, thinking the afterlife less a place than a pedagogy, an apprenticeship in weighing, in opening the hand at the right time, in choosing Mnemosyne when Lethe would be easier, in learning to be a guest, on earth, below, and back again in spring, when the queen climbs the stair seeds have counted. If you're here with him in this gentle middle hour, let your own room practice the same courtesies. A breath poured like a libation between sentences, a glance to the window where the dark presses only as firmly as a friendly palm, and tell me, if you like, where you're listening from, and what time your night keeps. And if these old paths steady you, consider subscribing to the entire history so we can keep this lantern lit together when the house is quiet and stories walk soft. He rose and stepped into the lane. The town lay in its patient geometry, bluing toward morning. By the fields, the laurel shivered once, and far off, riverward perhaps, came a sound that might have been an oar or only a heron lifting its slow intelligence from the reeds. He paused, sensing the road ahead would ask a different kind of listening, the kind kept for judges who weigh attachment more than arithmetic, for gardens where a door of shadow behaves like a hinge. Somewhere not far, someone tuned a lyre until the last string found the floor's tone, and beyond the hill, where the path bent out of sight, a dog who never barks turned its head and watched to see who would try the next gate. He began, without quite deciding to keep a ledger of faces, the living hands that made the border passable, and in that quiet catalogue the afterlife lost its chill and took on human warmth. There were the women who keened, weaving a narrow architecture out of breath and pitch so a room could hold sorrow without breaking. They braided hair and tied ribbons not to beautify the end, but to preserve the manners of care, and when their song rose, it was never spectacle but scaffolding, a frame the family could lean against until the first hours had passed. There were the washers, practical as midwives in reverse, who knew which oils soothed which rashes, how to ease a locked wrist so farewell could resemble the hand it had always been. Their names seldom reached the stone, yet every tender parting carried their signature like a watermark. There was the old potter with the crescent scar at his thumb who read fire, the way shepherds read weather. He lifted a white-ground lekythos into the low morning, and with the teacher's fondness, showed Hermes guiding a shade by the smallest touch. If the hand is too firm, he said, moistening a line, it turns to abduction. The soul must be invited. The stone cutter, apron powdered with the dust of names, taught a different civility. On one stele he carved the instant before touch, 2 fingers breathing toward each other and stopping a breath shy. On another he placed a faithful dog at an invisible threshold, not to menace, but to honour watchfulness. He had learned the grammar of grief, show the almost, not the after. Priests moved more lightly than rumour allowed. The Demeter priestess at the edge of town, whose steps remembered sowing and reaping, kept her attention without scolding. Once he watched her guide a child to pour milk onto the soil. The little hand trembled, the first drop fell wide, and the priestess simply smiled, tilting the bowl again until the ground accepted what it was offered. There were lawgivers too, men like Solon in the old accounts, who trimmed extravagance from funerals not to flatten sorrow, but to keep a city from drowning in display. They placed mourning within measure, as a lyre string must be tuned to sing at all. Rhapsodes bore their portion by opening old passages where Odysseus learned the dead hunger for remembrance, and where Achilles, once a moving thunderhead, confessed that a daylight among field hands outshines a king's fame in the shade. Such lines did not abolish ambition so much as correct its posture. Philosophers measured uprights at the margin like careful carpenters. One insisted that what lasts cannot be touched and must be trained toward by a steady turning of the mind. Another, more soil-sure, answered that whatever the heavens keep, a city's nobility is proved in the tidiness of a grave and the steadiness of a neighbour's hand beneath a weight. Even skeptics, those who suspected that darkness is only darkness, shouldered the bier because custom is a bridge kept in a repair whether or not one plans to cross it soon. He learned to love the humble technicians of passage, men who built biers, whose sway felt like rocking, not danger, chandlers who knew which wick would endure a gusty corner, the boy who ran ahead to plead quiet in the agora with a bow that honoured both commerce and loss. From farther provinces came strangers with other names for the same chores, an Orphic from the western coast with a leaf of gold folded like a secret sunrise, a Pythagorean who would not kill a cock yet spoke crisply of return, a down-country mason who swore that every tomb he set true steadied his own sleep, and moving just beyond the mortal guilds were the imagined functionaries whose stories kept people gentle. Hermes, in his unthreatening hat, alert to the dignity of escort. Charon, stern because fairness needs a face. The three judges, embodiments of balance rather than fear. Hecate at the threefold places where choices bloom by moonlight, Persephone, whose months below teach roots how to count, and whose steps above remind the living that joy returning is not the same as never having left. Scholars in the Stoa went on debating how binding were the gold tablets' passwords, how many held Tartarus as iron fact, and how many kept it as a moral picture that warns without warping. But in the lanes, such questions softened into practice. A mother, setting ladder cakes on a sill, did not cite doctrine, she repeated what worked. An uncle breaking bread and speaking a name did not map Elysium, he made a small meadow of the table, and our watcher, who had no office but attention, saw that the afterlife, so far as mortals can touch it, was being made continually by these trades of kindness, these modest excellences, a wail tempered into lament, a blade tempered into a ritual knife, a coin polished because fingers like to be sure. In that recognition his fear settled into something like courtesy. He kept a coin in a dish and a laurel sprig by the door. He learned to pause at thresholds and to listen for dogs who never bark. On certain nights he heard the city itself adjust, like a sleeper turning the pillow to the cool side, markets losing their clatter, sandals slowing, a silence poured as a libation along the curb. Then he would picture, from the angle of a star, all those small hands moving, the potter smoothing, the stone cutter brushing, the priestess guiding, the washer folding, and beneath them, far below, a river taking note, its skin unruffled, its current strong, and somewhere ahead, a plain opening into hush, where the almost touch carved in stone becomes a real breeze, lifting a gate just wide enough for a careful soul to pass. The river's names reached him first as music, lullabies with their consonants softened by distance, Acheron with its gravelly hush, Cocytus with a seam of weeping through it, Phlegethon with a dry crackle of heat, Styx with a stillness like a vow, and Lethe whispering its easy offer to lay burdens down. Meanings came later, but at the beginning there was only sound, a geography of feeling mapped onto water. Walking the harbour road at dusk, he thought how every city keeps its own half-visible underworld. Alleys where footsteps dissolve into brick, courtyards with a single jar, waiting to catch the day's last ounce of light. threshold stones polished by palms that have left and yet have not. A teacher once told him that Styx means hatred, not the hot flare but the cold refusal that seals itself like a contract. Oaths sworn there cannot be unmade. And even the gods honour that chill. He admired the severity of it, an ethic cut on bedrock, though part of him wondered whether mortals do better to bind their promises under warm lamps, where bread and company blunt the zeal's sharp edge. Phlegethon, they said, burns without consuming, a paradox fire more at home in story than in a hearth. He pictured it as the fevers of regret revisiting decent hearts, those nights when a word from months ago flares back and insists on being understood again. Cocytus, to his ear, gave grief the dignity of landscape, a place where sorrow could walk without apology. Acheron felt like ferries nosing through fog, like pilots who steer by listening, like returns that, though welcome, are quieted by what they cost. Lethe remained the most human, how easily we sip from whatever makes a day lighter, how rarely we choose mnemosiny on purpose. It's astringent medicine of clarity taken slowly, sip by steady sip. He put these thoughts to an elderly aunt, whose hands smelled of fennel and stone-ground grain, and she said, the rivers are inside us too. Some days you must be Styx to your own haste, some days Phlegethon to your pride, some days Lethe to a pain not yet carryable. But remember, she added, the ferryman does not take you down only once. Each evening you practice a little crossing, and each morning you return. Gentle scholars in the Stoa noticed his listening and offered a tempered discourse. One quoted poets who made the rivers moods of the soul. Another sketched 5 streams joining like fingers into a palm, and named that palm the plain where most shades hum in sameness. A third, stricter, held that Tartarus is not metaphor but warning. There are choices that kink the common weave so hard the cloth must be reset. Perhaps, he thought, both are true. The poet reports the interior weather. The lawgiver inks a contour no citizen can pretend not to see. In the lanes, talk ran simpler. A widow touching the carved almost hand on a steely said her husband would want the good remembered to keep it from thinning, and the harsh forgotten, so it would stop governing the table. A fisherman recalled a week when the sea mislaid its colour, and everything tasted of iron. He swore he rode through Cocytus, and was received by the harbour like a warm towel. A child, solemn with the justice of children, asked whether the dog at the gate ever sleeps. He naps with one eye, someone said. He thought again of Hermes, whose grace as psychopomp is to keep the path clear without insisting on it, to gesture with a hand that leaves room for choosing. The potter's Lekethos had already taught that ethics, and now the rivers gave it sound. On certain nights the city felt like a boat, with every house a lamplit window along the gunwale. He imagined that beneath the visible waterline the 5 streams braided, bearing off the day's redundancies and sending back, by subtler current, the day's earned clarities. He remembered the thin gold tablets, bright as an idea, light as patience, coaching the traveller to ask for Mnemosyne's pool and to speak the old kinship, child of earth and starry sky, wisdom that fits behind the tongue like a seed and promises as much. Yet he did not despise Lethe. There are wounds that ask for numbness first, as flesh prefers ice before balm, and even the rites allow the sequence, lament, washing, bread, name, quiet, each a stepping stone the spirit can find with bare feet. In a corner of the agora, a rhapsode recited of one hero who chose the herdsman's daylight over a king's shade, and of another who poured too much hope into a backward glance and learned what lovers learn. Trust is a practiced muscle, not an ornament. A philosopher smiled and said the soul must be taught not only to know, but to keep its knowing when darkness persuades. A mason passing by, hands chalked with measurements, added that the straightest line he ever set was the one laid over a friend's bones. Morning after morning he walked along the river that consents to be named the modest thread among the orchards, and let its small talk tune him for the day. It had no myth, only reeds and a heron considering choices. He greeted the laurel by the shrine, touched the lintel twice out of habit, and stood a coin upright in its dish to be sure the surface of his own promise was still bright. Winds from the west carried other underworlds, Etruscan gates guarded by grave smiles, Egyptian fields green as forever's morning. And he felt not contradiction but hospitality, every people shaping the place where a life meets its echo. As evening lowered its deep shade, he watched a dog watch nothing, meaning everything, and thought, how the city rehearses sleep, market voices dim, sandals soften, a final libation of quiet is poured along the stone, so that the ferry, wherever it runs, will find them ready. Beyond fields that had taken their winter breath, a current rehearsed its old names. Above, stars pinned their patient lights to the same calm cloth. Between them, in the seam where mortals learn, a gate of shadow seemed to breathe in and out as if preparing to open. Symbols came to him the way dawn comes, first as shapes at the edge of sight, then as meanings that warmed their own corners, until he understood the countryside was speaking a soft language of passage. Keys appeared everywhere once he learned to look, iron keys hung by doorways, bronze keys resting in a priestess's palm, painted keys in the hand of a queen whose realm ran root deep. The key was not only for locking, but for remembering that thresholds have keepers, and that courtesy is the first turn. Torches, too, learned to say more than light. At Eleusis, he had watched them behave like commas, pausing the long sentence of the road so bodies could breathe in darkness without haste. And now, even in ordinary lanes, a lamp lifted at evening felt like rehearsal for the gentler escort below. He loved how these signs worked without argument, the way a mother's touch teaches a child to lower a voice without ever explaining why. Fruit kept its own grammar. The pomegranate, all chambers of rubies, spoke of bargains kept and seasons counted on the palm. To eat is to belong, the fruit suggested, and to belong is to keep time with more than oneself. Laurel, evergreen and clean, read a room like a careful guest. A sprig at the threshold cooled the air, and more than once he touched it in passing, as one greets a colleague who keeps watch. He noticed how often doors were carved on stone, the world's patient illusion, lintel and jamb chiselled into a slab, and in relief a hand approaching another but stopping just shy. Such doors proposed that parting is not erasure but etiquette, that fingers leave room because respect requires distance, even in love. Dogs were everywhere, more faithful in image than most men in intention. On stelae, they sat with a scribe's concentration, guarding the visible side of a threshold no eye could cross. In stories, they doubled themselves below, one head for each path a traveller might take. He never saw one snarling. The craftsman's instinct matched his aunt's wisdom. Watchfulness is truer than menace. Butterflies and moths taught a lighter lesson. On a white ground vase, a psyche, drawn as a tiny winged being, hovered above a sleeper. A potter said, "The soul sometimes rises in dreams to practice leaving and returning, so that the last departure will not arrive as a stranger to the body." Bees made honey of the same idea, passing between worlds with gold quiet industry. Some tombs were called bee houses, and an old woman swore that if you told your bees about a death, They would keep the garden from forgetting. Wheat offered a theology any hand could learn. Seed sown under, blade rising, harvest taken, chaff released. The cycle read itself into people until grief discovered how to breathe inside it. In the Stoa, a philosopher drew a tidy diagram of reason, thumos, appetite, then closed his stylus with a smile, as if conceding that symbols often accomplish what arguments attempt. They invite understanding without waking pride. Even the simplest vessel carried weight. A lekythos left at a grave showed Hermes in a posture of accompaniment, hat tipped, palm open, teaching the living how to walk beside sorrow without tugging it. A crater hung with ivy remembered that wine loosens knots, grief tightens, just enough to let a name be spoken without breaking the cup of breath. Masks appeared in their seasons, not to conceal so much as to permit, to let laughter sit with loss, to let the living play the edge of fear until fear, embarrassed by courtesy, took a seat and listened. In small shrines he learned other tokens, a miniature ladder of dough on a sill so a guest from below might find the window, a string of wool tied round a jar to seal a promise, a pair of sandals hung by the door so a traveller would not, in eagerness, forget the feet. Words were symbols too. The farewell choir, rejoice, had the grace to place benediction beside grief, and the Orphic line folded into a leaf of gold carried pride and humility in one breath, child of earth and starry sky. He began to see that symbols were not trinkets, but tools for shaping feeling, handles the hand can find in the dark. When a storm soldered the roofs and sent fishermen to their cups, the city's images drew closer to their meanings. Someone set a key on the table before cutting bread, and the gesture steadied the meal. Someone else lifted a torch by daylight to honour a name, and no one mocked him, because each had needed such a bright sentence once. Even skeptics kept a coin by the door. In a market corner a rhapsode sang of Thanatos and Hypnos, twin brothers stepping soft like servants in a house that loves quiet, and a child fell asleep in her mother's lap as if to testify. At a crossroads, old women left a morsel for Hecate, not from dread, but from respect for places where choices gather. The moon paid attention there, and dogs in the distance consented to speak. Watching, he learned, the afterlife looked less like a district on a map, and more like the city's habit of shaping feeling into form, a key for entering and leaving, a torch for seeing and being seen, a fruit for counting and belonging, a door for parting with love, a dog for guarding the between, a butterfly for practicing return. One might almost live by these alone, and he thought unhurriedly, as one turns a coin in lamplight, if symbols are small boats, then ritual is the river they know by heart. The rain lifted. The town's edges resumed their soft geometry. He walked toward the boundary, where orchards thin to scrub and the long bones of hills begin. Somewhere ahead lay caves with mouths like vowels, a river whose name gathers fog, a marsh where reeds keep a queen's secrets, a rocky coast where the sea writes and erases at once, and all of it, he felt, had taught the people their symbols before the people could name them. In that direction, where the land inclines its ear to older music, the road narrowed to a single thread, and on that thread, like a needle drawing through cloth, the next mystery waited with a patient, open eye. The land seemed to hold the doctrine long before priests found words for it, the way a cliff keeps singing after the singer is gone, and he began to see how mountains, caves, coasts and springs had braided a people's map of below as surely as any rhapsode ever had. In the far west, where daylight thins to copper, Sailors watched the sun settle into the horizon's great bowl and felt, without any argument, that beyond that burnished lip lay meadows of ease. Elysium was less a guess than a nightly rehearsal. The disk descending, heat loosening its hold, the promise that a day's hard labour could apprentice into gentler work. Along the northwestern slopes, in the country of grey-green oaks and sudden ravines, a river kept the old name Acheron and trained the living with its mists, marsh flats that gathered fog into rooms, reed beds, whispering like elder women at a wake. Above it, a sanctuary leaned from the bank, where petitioners entered, not to be frightened, but to receive permission to ask grief one clean question. Inland, where rock rises from pasture the way a thought rises from talk, caves opened like vowels. At Tyneron the sea gnawed a mouth into the land, and legend said heroes use that hinge when errands outstripped ordinary will. Elsewhere a lake, whose shore had memorized the tread of mourners, kept Acherusia for its title, so water and story could recognize each other by touch. He learned the local habit of letting stone decide the law. A cleft that breathed cool in high summer became a plausible corridor. A spring with a mineral strangeness volunteered for Lethe or for Mnemosyne, according to whether forgetting was mercy or a braver clarity was needed. In Arcadia, a black waterfall dropped from a cliff face dark enough to be a night by itself. People said oaths could be rinsed there down to their bare truth, and the Styx was no mere line in a poet's chart, but a paralysis of cold gathered into this particular fall, light on neither bird nor boast. Farther east, where coastlines fold into small confessions and islands, string themselves like beads, fennel and salt rode the night wind. The sea-patient schoolmaster wrote the grammar of return, sending ships out into hazard and bringing them home, sometimes in pieces, always in stories, so Persephone's seasonal step became the pulse by which boatmen and mothers kept time. Volcanic islands to the south muttered a deeper lesson. The earth is not still. Below and above converse through vents of fire and ash, and if Tartarus belongs anywhere on a map, it borrows the colour of those throats that glow from within, where stone remembers a heat too old to name. At Delphi, the mountain offered a precinct where breath could be coaxed from silence by ritual and patience, whether that voice rose from a seam in rock or a seam in the heart mattered less than the civic truth. The ground is not mute, and listening itself is a form of worship. The orchards kept a gentler theology. Year after year the trees convinced hands that the dead are not gone, like flame from ash, but present as pattern and timing, as sweetness pressed from what was buried. When a branch bowed with fruit, people felt the mysteries spoken in another grammar. That descent and return were agriculture, taught leaf by leaf. Often he stood on a ridge and read the slopes like a choreographer of thresholds. Here a goat path rounds a spur, and the world falls away. Good ground for Hecate's attention. There a saddle widens into a pass where the moon seems always to hesitate. Good place to set bread for a traveller with light feet and older errands. Even the city learned from its seat. Towns fronting long western waters spoke calmly of beyond. Those cupped in limestone bowls made their afterlife domestic. Quays on lintels, stairs cut into rock. The sense that below was the next room, and the dog at the threshold a familiar colleague. He began to think of the underworld as a kind of weather, conducted by the land, marshes carrying the fog of gentling, cliffs keeping the law of oaths, caves lending their patient lungs to stories of passage, fields proving that what is buried keeps its appointment with light. From colonies and cousins came other geographies the Greeks adopted without betraying themselves. Italian lakes littered with such still shadow that a bird's wing sounded too loud. Northern rivers, dark with pine, teaching a different patience. And in the borrowing, they showed a largeness. The map of below is wide enough for more than one syllable of fear, more than one accent of hope. He noticed, too, that the city's guardrails against excess, laws trimming pomp, measures spreading lament across days instead of hours, mirrored the moderation of its land. A gentle coast invites gentle rites. A hard coast asks for a sparer grammar, and both can be noble if kept with care. One winter evening he walked to the boundary where orchards end and scrub takes over, that seam where cultivated patience hands the night back to rock and wind. Laurel breathed its clean breath at his shoulder. A small key cooled his palm into precision, and down valley a river practiced its old syllables under the fog. He thought how any landscape, listened to long enough, discloses its counsel for living and for leaving. The Greeks, attentive as farmers and bold as sailors, had listened well. He turned for home, steps unhurried, the sky holding its last pewter, and as he reached the gate, 2 stones, a lintel, a dog pretending not to see, a thin torch flame came down the lane, cupped in hands, and moving like a comma through the sentence of the dark. With voices behind it, quiet as decision, gathering for a rite that would test not only a family's love, but a city's memory, the way currents test a boat before it meets the open seam. He had long suspected that even the gentlest maps carry their seams and stress lines, and as he watched the city keep its rights with a steadiness borrowed from hills and harbours, he began to notice the quieter frictions under the surface, how beliefs, like plates of earth, press and ease, collide, then settle on a new shape. The oldest tales remembered the first quarrel as one of generations, Titans shouldering at the limits of what would later be called order, Zeus binding what would not be persuaded, that thunder, he thought, still echoes in human rooms whenever a household argues over how much of the dead belongs at the living's table. In Athens, laws once pruned funeral pomp, the way a careful gardener thins a vine. No dirges poured endlessly into the street, no hired lament squandered like wind through reeds. Women led the wail, but were asked not to tear the city's fabric. Solon's moderation was not a cold refusal, but a civic treaty with silence, a promise that grief could be deep without becoming theatre, that the polis would not be held captive by any one sorrow. Elsewhere, along lonelier coasts, mourning burned hotter, and the 2 temperaments met in the market like different winds, learning to share a corner. Priests guarding the mysteries made their pact. With time, revelation may remake a heart, but must not flood the streets. And in that pact lived an alliance of kinds, between private tenderness and public order, between the lamp inside and the sanctioned flame outside. Not all agreed. In some seasons, Orphic circles, tending their gold leaves and soft passwords like seedlings, hinted that the common road was not the only road, that a soul might earn a clearer meadow if it learned the names of springs. Philosophers, carpenters of clarity, disputed without raising their voices. One argued that such hopes make the mind supple and the hand cleaner. Another replied, just as calm, the privileges beyond the grave endanger the equal dignity of funerals, which should be measured by present love, not secret learning. He admired how the quarrel, kept within manners, hardened into strength, like timber made durable by opposing grains. Politics eddied through as well, tyrants borrowing the language of dissent and returned to crown themselves with an aura from below, promising harvests and safe gates if citizens would accept a new key on the ring. Citizens, shrewder than they looked, nodded as one nods at weather. Yes, Rain is coming, and kept the coin dish by the window, as their grandmothers had. Alliances formed across distances of land and feeling. Eleusis, once the ritual heart of a single plain, drew pilgrims from cities that had quarrelled over grain and islands. In the shared dark, enemies lowered shields long enough to carry torches in one procession, a quiet diplomacy conducted in the grammar of feet and flame. Colonies ferried the courtesies east and west like careful contraband. In new harbours, beneath unfamiliar constellations, the old habits rooted, a drop of wine to the ground, a name spoken low, a door painted on stone, and in time those ports sent back their own flavours, Etruscan brows, Roman order, Egyptian fields forever green. Each encounter asked gently whether the Greek map could widen and still be itself. Most days it could. When foreign judges took seats beside Minos in the middle imagination, weighing lives with scales trained to another calibration, no one cried betrayal. They set another chair and listened. Power shifted as it always does, not only on battlefields but in the small laws that teach a city how to remember. One generation secured graves with penalties against theft. Another reigned in lavish processions that threatened to curl piety into spectacle. A later, more bookish age turned the underworld into a school where souls advanced by how well they had corrected their loves. Each turn met resistance, then accommodation, then the soft merge by which customs endure because they have learned to bend without breaking. Even among the gods, the tone altered. Hades, first imagined as implacable geometry, the keeper of keys and ledgers, acquired grave courtesy under poets who had learned real grief. Persephone's months below felt less like exile, more like stewardship, the queen moving through storerooms to see the roots fed. Hermes, never doctrinal, kept alliances simple, with the living who need escort, the dead who deserve company. The city's wise enough to keep the downward road as tidy as the one that runs to market. Some borrowed myths required rebuke. When later writers sharpened Tartarus into a furnace for enemies with the wrong banners or the wrong thoughts, elders who still kept bread and keys at table quietly corrected the tune. No threats at supper, they would say. The afterlife is not your weapon. In such gentle resistance, the city preserved itself from zeal. He saw, too, how treaties are forged within a single body. Appetite, breath, and mind each make their claim. In the Stoa, a teacher smiled and said, the best alliances are internal, that one who persuades anger to sit, fear to listen, pride to wait its turn, will meet the judges below with little trouble. At funerals, the classes learned their truces. The rich, fond of long speeches, accepted the measure of tears. The poor, loyal to the old keening, allowed the procession to breathe. Children, whose politics are instinct, carried laurel for both sides. Power moved across generations, the grandmother's rules softening to the mother's customs becoming the son's reflex written as the city's moderate law. News out of Rome, prosaic, ambitious, translated Greek patience into statute. The underworld travelled there under different names and salaries, yet the dog at the gate remained a dog at the gate, and a hand paused an inch from touching another on fresh-cut stone. He thought, with affectionate irony, that the dead are the city's most stable party. They do not canvass, and yet their votes are counted in the way the living arrange their days. When factions threatened to sour a festival, someone spoke the names at dusk, and anger thinned like fog. When a demagogue tried to trade reverence for fear, old women set ladder cakes on the steps and made the night remember its manners. In such acts, a republic of feeling held. He learned to walk the alleys where disagreement cooled into thought. The underworld he loved was not a courtroom of punishments, but a senate of courtesies, continually negotiating between Lethe and Mnemosyne, between ritual's necessary form and the soul's need to cry once, clean and unmeasured. He carried a coin, as his grandparents had, and also a philosopher's question, what have I loved, and how? And found the two weights kept his stride honest. Some evenings a far orator demanded a sterner rule, a brighter procession. He listened until the sentences tired, then took the quiet road where dogs do not bark, and laurel breathes its clean breath. At his own door he touched the lintel twice, and let the house receive him. Far beyond the orchards a torch line moved, along a ridge like patient stars. Close by, under the eaves, a moth practised its little crossing, from shadow to lamp, and back again, reminding him that every alliance worth keeping is made in such faithful small flights, and that somewhere ahead, past one more curve of lane, one more key turned with care, a gate of shadow waits with the tact of a good host, ready to open at the pressure of a courteous hand. He began to notice that beneath the hymns and the hush there ran an economy as patient as groundwater, feeding the rites without ever calling attention to itself, the way a well keeps a town upright and no one writes odes to buckets. The afterlife, for all its distance, employed local hands. Fields yielded barley for cakes that mothers shaped into little ladders. Presses coaxed olive oil to gloss the skin of the newly quiet. Hives lent their honey to anoint the lips so a name could leave sweetly. Each gift travelled the lanes in baskets and jars, and with every exchange the living rehearsed what they most hoped the dead would find: steadiness, sufficiency, a courtesy that does not fail. The potter's quarter woke early. Clay, the colour of a dove's back, came by barge, was trundled on sledges to sheds where wheels turned like second suns. White ground lekythoi, those pale lamps of morning, took shape under hands, educated by necessity into tenderness. Hermes was painted with the gentlest authority. Persephone, with a composure that taught waiting, and the brush, charged with a black like midnight tamed, knew exactly how much air to leave between two almost touching fingers. A merchant of slips and pigments arrived twice a month with his little chest, soot and iron, resinous wines, a red the shade of pomegranate seeds. He sold on credit when he must, because grief, he liked to say, pays in time. Farther on, marble moved. From the quarries men brought blocks whose sleeping light had waited millennia. Oxen leaned into their collars as if bowing to a temple not yet imagined. The stone cutters' guild divided labour with a civility that resembled prayer. Apprentices roughed the form, journeymen softened the fall of a robe, masters set the hands. The pay was modest beside public statues, yet steady. Memory, the city knew, is a kind employer. Laurel sprigs that cooled thresholds grew on hills no one thought to fence. A widow and her daughter gathered them at dawn and sold them in small bunches tied with reed. 2 for the poor, 3 for those who could afford the extra freshness. Charcoal burners stacked their kilns like black loaves and sold to potters and men who kept the pyres. Woodcutters learned a particular grammar of flame so that burning felt like rocking, not rage. The coin for Charon brought metalworkers into the circle. No law fixed the mint. Any coin would do, but superstition and convenience set a fashion. Smaller denominations lay gentler in the mouth, so obols and charquois found steady demand. A silversmith, half poet and half accountant, said, "Death keeps the small change market honest." He put aside prettily misstruck pieces. The gods, he said, accept a blemish offered with love, and on market days he polished them until they flashed like captive moons. Incense travelled far. Myrrh and frankincense came with sailors smelling of tar and salt. From coasts where other gods drew breath, a dockside broker who had never read a philosopher could still deliver a speech on how crossing a sea teaches kinship between pantheons. Resin bricks were shaved into smoke that stitched rooms into one room. The desert cutter's wage, the caravan's risk, the harbour dues, the perfumer's scale, all were hidden in a single thin curl sweetening a name. In the agora, a brazier keeper rented his fire by the hour to mourners, sealing jar lids and softening wax. Nearby, a seller of linen kept bolts of the mildest weave for the last dressing, agreeing with the law that pomp should be trimmed. Waste, he would murmur, smoothing a sheet, is a kind of rudeness. He heard too of taxes that guarded resting places from theft and vulgarity, small fees to keep paths clear, sharper penalties for stripping graves. Revenue paid the watchmen who nodded in olive shade, and the men who recopied names when lichen began to eat the stone. No one grew rich by these measures. Riches were for ships and estates, but the commerce of the underworld sustained a steady belt of households whose work kept the threshold passable. Bakers, weavers, woodmen, carters, masons, musicians who tuned lament into structure, women who kept basins bright as moons. Farther afield, the great trades leaned in. Grain from the Nile, green brag, riding in ship bellies, meant a city could spare barley for cakes all year. Wine from time-scented islands made Anthesteria generous, tin and copper from corners he knew only by sailors' hands gave smiths their alloys for keys that were more than metal, the city's treaty about entrances and farewells. In the Stoa, a stern man argued it was superstition gilded with commerce. A gentler voice answered that commerce itself becomes right when it is used to keep love tidy. He decided both were partly right. Accounts mattered. Measures kept custom from swelling into spectacle. Yet a city that paid potters on time and singers fairly seemed to sleep better, as though the dead, satisfied with workmanship, held the gates more kindly. At home he kept his own small budget with care, a dish for the coin, refreshed when the silver dulled, a laurel sprig replaced before it gathered dust, a jar of honey he never dipped for pleasure, reserving it as one reserves a word never to use lightly. Sometimes, when the harbour masts ticked and the moon had the colour of nickel, he walked the wharf and watched ledgers being tallied, chalk on slate, cords around sacks, and heard in that rhythm the same assurance he heard in prayer: what is owed will be answered, what is offered will be received, the road between hands can be kept smooth. He thought of Elysium, described as a meadow where labour is not abolished but perfected, the scythe forever sharp, the furrow forever ready, the day exactly long enough, and smiled at the hunch that heaven, if it exists, owns good tools. A wind came from the west, with a scent like rain on bronze. Torches along the quay lifted their small, grammar-perfect flames. Inland, a kiln clicked as it cooled, sealing into clay a scene of ferry in hand. He turned toward home, coin light in his pocket, and saw, far upridge, the thin procession of torches that had become, across years, his favourite line of poetry, moving through the dark. He followed with his eyes until the lamps folded into the hill. Then he listened, because a new sound had begun, low, insistent, like a door considering its hinge. And the night itself, precise as a bookkeeper and tender as a midwife, seemed to add one more line to the ledger of returns. If doctrine was weather and rites the road, then the things themselves, the cloth and clay, the timber and stone, were the ground beneath every step, teaching even the inattentive how to move among thresholds. He learned to read linen first. Quiet bolts, mild as morning, waited in shop-front shade for the last task they would ever be asked to do. When the washers laid a body out, the shroud took folds the way a river takes light, and the pinning, two bronze clasps placed as calmly as commas, spoke a grammar of respect no argument could improve. Garlands were clothing too, laurel for cleanness, myrtle for sweetness, olive for the patience that braids itself into endurance. Women twined them with a seriousness that seemed to raise the ceiling, and when a wreath settled on hair combed into obedience, the face beneath looked less like an exit than a doorway kept in good repair. Living garments had their say as well. A father's hymation, worn to the softness of old paper, might be folded across his knees one final time in a sculptor's memory. A mother's peplos, faint with resin and oil, caught the lamplight just so, telling the youngest child without a word that brightness too is an inheritance. On graves, stone remembered fabric. The carver's hand taught marble to droop and cling. The wet drapery critics praise, and neighbours simply recognise as true. And those folds, falling from a wrist or gathered at a hip, had the tenderness of someone settling a blanket over a sleeper. Tools kept the threshold in order. The potter's wheel held its round promise, and the Lekethos, tall, pale, a slim column of calm, offered scenes as modest as a good guest. Hermes walking one step behind, a seated figure turning with that angle of neck that means listening. A boat's prow, a single oar, cupped, as if catching whispered instruction from the dark. In one corner, a boy ground pigment, with a sound like small rain, black for outline, dull red for fruit and ribbon. In finer shops, a breath of blue appeared, remembering sky without claiming it. The mason's kit lay nearby like a prayer answered in iron. Chisels, mallets, a square that told the truth to stone without ever raising its voice. Niaskoi rose along the road, like little houses that knew how grain runs. Their pediments kept doves, their doors admitted only eyes, and within, reliefs practiced the city's favourite lesson, the moment before touch, the fingertips pause, the love that holds instead of clutching. The necropolis read like a street of manners. Some households kept their markers modest, a stealer with the simplest shire. Others, richer or more restless, set a bench where the living could sit and bring the dead into noon. A few raised lions whose calms suggested proportion rather than menace, reminding visitors that pride and grief alike must be tuned. Scholars argued gently over what the city should allow. Laws trimmed the extravagant not to impoverish remembrance, but to preserve its shape. He liked the measure. Dignity scaled so a child could carry it in two hands. Inside houses, doorways rehearsed departures. Keys hung on wool cords like small careful stars. Thresholds shone where sandals learned the same step day after day. A narrow-mouthed jar by the door taught generosity its pour. Even the kitchen instructed, mortars that knew the weight of grain, knives that set aside a perfect slice for the name spoken before the meal. In such exactness, a family learned that the afterlife begins, in its way, with supper done well. Instruments found their hour. Flutes borrowed the tone of wind through reeds along a foggy river. A lyre, tuned to the floor, drew out a lament that neither accused nor gave up, but steadied the air into a listening shape. The men who built biers set their slats so that swaying on uneven lanes felt like rocking, not risk. The candlemaker, who could read a room's draughts with his eyes closed, poured wicks schooled to survive corners. Out beyond, the quarries offered sleeping light. Marble came down the road like cooled thunder, veined with accidents that carvers turned into mercy. If a flaw ran through a shoulder, a dog might sit there instead, or a basket of fruit, or a fold of cloth. Imperfection promoted to icon. He often thought that perfection, if it exists, must know how to be kind to stone. Beyond craft stood the little devices of permission, a dough ladder on a sill so a guest from below might find the polite window, a ribbon knotted thrice round a jar to seal a promise, a bowl with a lip shaped for libation, because offerings too deserve a clean fall. Ships contributed their metaphors. On Crates, the ferry to below was a working boat, not a magic one. The orbit water at a fisherman's angle, and the wake drew a line that said simply, "Trust the stroke you've practiced." He loved that even in myth the body recognizes the honest physics of care. Across all these objects ran the city's one quiet doctrine: love, if it is to last, needs handles the hand can find in the dark. Historians still dispute beginnings. Did the white ground lekythos pale to suggest unpainted dawn? Or did workshops discover a grace in restraint? Did the Naiskos imitate a house to domesticate fear? Or do artisans chisel most truthfully what they live among? The answers mattered and did not. What mattered was how these things taught the living to keep edges soft, to leave a breath between fingers, to set a coin where an eye can find it at night. And when the last chisel rang, and evening placed its cool palm on the sheds, he felt how tools sleep with their purposes half open, ready to rise without flurry when a door is knocked. Far off, a rhapsode's voice threaded the olive rose, the tale of a queen who counts seeds, of a lover who turned too soon, of a hero who chooses a farmer's daylight over a king's shade. And he knew the next nights would belong to the core myths with their branching paths, the stories that walk by torchlight down into the dark and return not with answers, but with a way of breathing that lets the door decide when to open. The old stories gathered like friends at twilight, each bringing a dish seasoned by its own valley. And when he set them side by side, he saw not contradiction, but the abundance of a good table. One song began where the sea keeps its colder grammar, a wanderer carving a trench, pouring dark blood, and summoning anxious shades who crowded like sparrows at scattered grain. They told him what the bright world cannot hold for long, that fame thins in the afterlight, that a mother's hands are remembered as warmth before counsel, that a friend's smile outlasts the oiled thunder of war. Another tale walked in carrying a lyre, the musician whose grief tuned the underworld until even stones felt their tenderness. He was given a permission no one gets twice, and nearly made it home. Nearly. But the backward look, that small human hunger to be sure, taught a long lesson. Trust is not a feeling, but a practiced gait, and the last step must be taken as carefully as the first. Heavier stories followed. A labour-loving strong man descended and returned with a dog whose many heads had learned to watch 3 ways at once. The point was not theft, but discipline, the way strength yoked to obedience passes gates without quarrel. Comedies that turned stern when told slowly arrived too. 2 companions who dared a queen's threshold and felt the very stone hush beneath them. A young wife whom death admired for orderliness and returned to daylight out of courtesy. A wily king who taught deceit so long he earned a rest. That is work, pushing a stone that remembers the first shove more keenly than the last breath. Some myths wore the grain of instruction. A curious boy lifted a lid and learned time does not go back into jars. A clever thief stole fire and found that gifts unmannered scorch the hand that brings them. Below, a bench staffed by names that sound like balances More than men weighed not tallies, but attachments, measuring what a life had loved and how tightly it held. And then the tale that is less story than calendar, a mother unconsoled, a daughter counting seeds, 6 on winner's fingers, the rest on springs, fields learning to breathe by that arithmetic, bakers shaping loaves with reverence for absence alongside flour. These narratives braided and unbraided, like water in a marsh. In one stream, the blessed dwell on an island where wind keeps its promise and labour perfects itself into ease. In another, souls return, sober as students, to try again, carrying a faint after scent of former choices like smoke in hair, a justice of memory rather than flame. A gold tablet, folded like sunlight in a purse, coached the traveller. Choose Mnemosyne's cool, not Lethe's smooth. Elsewhere, a philosopher turned dissent into a field report from a soldier who died, visited the sorting grounds, and brought back a map, not of punishments, but of inclinations corrected and loves repaired. He liked how the tales corrected each other without shouting. When Tartarus grew gaudy under later tongues, steadier elders remembered the bench's original mood. Exact, not vengeful, so the city would not learn to govern by fear. When Elysium sugared in foreign mouths, farmers quietly brought fruit to funerals, saying with patience, "Bliss is a meadow you mow, not a couch you fall upon." When the liar's tale tempted grief to break itself by turning back, mothers poured a drop and taught forward-looking sorrow. Bread, name, sleep, dawn. Even the ferryman learned new faces and kept the same work. On vases he scowled or merely looked busy. In poems he was stern. In potter's hands he seemed tired and fair. Either way the oar bit steadily, and the wake repeated the underworld's kindest truth: passage exists. He kept noticing how myth favoured the hinge over the aftermath, as though wisdom lives in the moment before. Carved fingers nearly touching, the painted door forever closed, the hero pausing on the last stair, remembering not to turn. The queen poised between storehouse and field with a lamp that is both seed and lore. Variants turned that poise into pedagogy. In one, the dead drink forgetting and are relieved. In another, they choose remembering and grow strong. The city, needing both, set feast days for each. Times to sand grief's edge, times to sharpen gratitude's outline. Late, he smiled at the mildness with which the stories protect the living from certitude. Ask 3 singers about Hades, and you will hear 3 true hums. Shadows ache for names. Justice is a long arithmetic of love. Return is real, but never guaranteed. Ask 3 craftsmen, potter, stonecutter, weaver, and they will show the same truths in clay, edge, and fold. Ask the dog at the threshold, and you will hear nothing, which is sometimes the best answer. Winds arrived carrying cousins of the Greek dead, reeds green forever, crocodile-baled rivers, mounds where chariots wait in saddled silence, and he felt hospitality rather than threat. The map of below, he thought, is large enough for many accents of hope, and a city that keeps its coin dish bright can greet a foreign ferry without losing its own oarstroke. Outside, an actual river rehearsed low syllables under fog. Inside, the coin stood in its dish like a moon considering tides. At the door, Laurel kept breathing its clean, perpetual breath, and along the street a torch went by, with the gentle calm motion he had come to love. He drowsed in the elder's chair and let the myths layer like blankets. Odysseus's trench, Orpheus's stride, Heracles' leash, Persephone's stairs, a judge's cool hand on the scale, a craftsman's thumb smoothing a small painted boat, and woke sure that the next nights would lean toward a knowledge older than books, survivals and strategies that keep a house aligned with seasons and thresholds. Habit turning belief into bread, and bread into a kindness that lights the road both ways. While dawn, unhurried, let one more degree of gold into the room, and the dog at the gate pretended to sleep, so he would not have to explain why he watched. He came to trust that the steadiness keeping the living close around their dead did not live in scrolls but in hands, in how water was poured, how a door was closed, which corner of a room was left uncomplicated, so silence could sit. And he leaned on that unbooked wisdom, the way a shepherd trusts a path he has walked in fog. Old women carried much of it, their palms faint with fennel and ash. They taught that a house returns to balance by small obediences. Set a bowl of clean water by the door for the night's returning feet. Cross a pinch of salt between finger and thumb over the threshold so absence will not grow greedy. Keep a coin always visible so passage will never catch you unprepared. They kept a grammar for miasma, the dust of death that calls for tidying rather than terror. Wash what touched the last breath, light a little fire, and let smoke walk the room's outline. Do not let lament rise into a tide that carries furniture away. If a death occurred on the road or at sea, the city's memory offered substitutes, a cenotaph to receive footsteps, a name inscribed so the wind would have an address. Sailors carried their own medicine, knots tied thrice against a crosswind, coins sewn in hems because storms teach haste, a whispered greeting to the dog carved on a pier post as a reminder to the gate below that these men know their manners. In sickness or siege, the wisdom grew simpler, burn bedding only after one night of quiet, grief must sleep once before it yields its cloth. Share bread and onions outdoors rather than under a low ceiling. Laments carry better in air that knows weight. Walk the perimeter with fire at dusk for 3 evenings, not to frighten shades who do not startle easily, but to tell fear where the edges are. And when battle's names arrived on stiff papyrus and a priest steadied his voice to duty, the city made choices that kept souls from fraying. Find the bodies first. If you cannot, raise a stone anyway and give the day a hinge. Boys were taught that courage extends past the spear to the washing and the remembering, and girls that keening is not a contest but a rope thrown across a gap to help the first hours cross. Farmers, who spend a life asking ground for favour, kept a practical theology. Bury with barley near. The earth understands better when grain is listening. Do not plough the funeral path for a time. Let the soil keep the imprint of feet that walked away with a friend. Tell the bees, go to the hives and speak the name. Forget this, and honey loses a little of its light. Greet the dogs, especially in the week after, for they keep the seam between here and below tidy by watching and do not like to be ignored. At shrines, knowledge turned to choreography. The right hand pours, the left steadies, the eyes attend the lip, so the libation falls without splash. Keys are touched before torches are lit, permission before illumination. At Eleusis, the wit of a plain became right. Seed, ash, seed, descent spoken with feet, return with breath. In villages with no mysteries, the same content wore humbler clothes. Winter loaves scored with 6-petaled cuts, a daughter's hair unbound for a season, then bound again, when the first grain proved, patience remembers. He watched the city rescue itself from cruelty with these arts of measure. When a man's anger threatened to turn a funeral into a sentence, old neighbours arrived with bread and diverted the river of talk into lower ground. When a woman's lament began to gather spectators, as thunder gathers corners, the keeners softened their pitch until the room remembered that grief is truest when it does not perform. A philosopher, standing kindly aside, told him the soul survives by calibrating its loves. The old women answered, without disputing, practice the calibration now. Choose which slight to forget, so supper can be eaten. Choose which tenderness to remember, so mourning can bear fruit. Thus, without diagrams, the people rehearsed Lethe and mnemosine in cups and sentences, in what they let pass and what they repeated. Other survivals kept their voices low. A boy with a gift for tools learned to make beers that did not jolt. He grew old, and the city's spine stood straighter for it. A candlemaker taught her daughter to read drafts. Widowed young, she never let a procession suffer a blown wick. The potter with the thumb scar showed an apprentice how to paint the almost touch that says love more faithfully than any carved embrace. When the apprentice buried his father, he did not clutch the air. Mothers tucked passwords into lullabies so courage would not be foreign when choosing springs, child of earth and starry sky, reached the ear years before it might be needed. Even skepticism had a courteous shape that saved the city from breaking. Men who doubted below still took a beer's corner, because doubt without duty ferments into something unclean. For those pierced too sharply, the tender who do not know where to set their grief, the city offered assignments: sweep the path to the necropolis at dawn, keep laurel fresh at the boundary stone, sit with the washers and learn which oils, answer which rashes. Work steadies sorrow. The dead, if they watch, approve. He kept a small book of remedies. When the house grew crowded with absences, open the shutters and let the agorer's noise braid with silence, until both learn to share a room. When a name begins to thin in the mouth, write it on bread with honey, and speak it before eating. The body remembers what the mind drops. When fear stands at the bed's foot, counting backward, light a lamp and count forward in seeds, 6 for winter, the rest for return. He found a cure for rain too. Sit by the door and listen to the dog who does not bark. Let its patience teach the hour. In time, this common stock, household field harbour, made even philosophy gentler. Teachers spoke more softly of judges and scales. Penances changed into practices. Virtue put on the weight and warmth of habit. When cousins from other coasts brought their survivals, Egypt's green, where ploughs never tire, italic gates with their stern attendants, the city did not stiffen. It made room at the table, laid out an extra key, asked to learn. One evening he walked to the quay where foreign hulls wrote shadows on the water and stood among sacks that smelled of other harvests. Lamps climbed a distant mast like patient embers. Behind him, in the lanes, an old woman pinned fresh laurel to a door. He felt the map widen, not by conquest, but by hospitality. And out past the last buoy, a wind that had crossed other thresholds came in slow, tasting of resin and distant grain, as if carrying the next lesson the city would need when it met the wider world. The day arrived, as it does for sailors and cities alike, when the familiar map of Rites raised its gaze and found other coasts looking back, and in that exchange the afterlife learned new accents without losing its own low music. Merchants carried more than amphora. Between jars and bales travelled small courtesies, prayers salted for the journey, ways of tending thresholds that had crossed water long before the speakers did. In Egyptian harbours, he watched a procession of palms and sistrums, a goddess whose name tasted like sunlight on stone, Isis, walking beside funerary boats that pictured the fields of reeds not as fable, but as agriculture perfected, furrows forever straight, and waters forever on time. Priests weighed hearts against a feather, and he did not argue, For his own city had spoken in another grammar of judges and attachments, and the quiet arithmetic of loves. In Alexandria, where languages braid like ropes, he heard of Serapis, a god stitched from many households into one cloak, bull and grain and underworld kindness, promising that memory and healing could share a temple. He thought of Demeter's flower-dusted hands, of Persephone counting seeds under the season, and felt kinship rather than quarrel. Westward, italic towns with roofs that hold a colder light, painted gates with stern attendants, Charon with his hammer, Vanth with her wings, faces less graceful than his potters loved to draw, yet keeping the same office. Not tormentors, ushers who make order visible. Near Avernus, a round-mouthed lake, breathing the world's old breath, sailors spoke in a tone that asked for respect. He nodded, remembering Tyneron's sea-bitten vowel of a cave, and Arcadia's oath-tasting spring, and felt how geography tutors theology one coast at a time. Rome translated manners into statute. The parentalia and feralia taught families to tend the dead with bread, garlands, and measured quiet. Lamps rose in columbaria like little cities of light, names carved with a discipline that resembled love, and when poets there sang of a hero guided down by a golden bough, they kept the ancient pledge in a new metre. Passage exists, and courtesy opens it. From farther east he heard, softly, as men do who respect fire, of a bridge drawn thin over a gulf of judgment, each footfall a test of truth. He received the moral more than the map. Integrity is balance, and the width of any crossing is the width of a life kept honest. Levantine docks carried a quieter hope that shades would not remain shades forever, but rise when time turns like a field. He could not picture that morning precisely, yet he knew the housekeeping inside the promise, the insistence that justice can wake. And he remembered how his own rites were always an education in repair. Gold leaves turned up in graves far from home, thin Orphic lamellae folded small as seeds in Italian soil, and he smiled at their persistence. Child of earth and starry sky, spoken beneath different constellations, kinship none the less true. Foreign workshops carved sarcophagi in mixed tongues, Heracles resting near winged guides with Etruscan names, Persephone in a robe whose fold had learned Roman discipline, keys and torches and pomegranates arranged like a phrase translated but still singing. He learned to relish the traffic of comforts, perfumes from Egypt teaching a new sweetness to smoke, textiles from Syria giving shrouds a hush with another shade in it, little bronze keys from Anatolia whose wards unlocked nothing but imagination, and from his side of the sea went clay and gestures, the almost touch, the one oar cupped, the dog without snarl. Some said mixtures weaken. He, watching widows share bread with women whose gods wore other faces, decided mixtures, kept within manners, strengthen. Even philosophers grew hospitable in their precisions. One, with a stylus that had touched more than one alphabet, sketched a meadow beyond judgment where souls choose their next lives. Another, Roman and exact, fashioned a descent as an education for governance, each encounter a lesson, each gate a law. Through it all, the ferry's oar kept its angle. In distant inns, he still set a coin where his hand could find it in the dark. Laurel still cooled a doorway. A dog's patience still made the hour polite, yet his ear learned cousins in the hush, crocodile water dreaming of green forever, a hammer tapping lintel, to remind choices to be careful, a bridge weighing footsteps with a calm no hurry can bribe. He came home by a road whose stones recognized his tread, and the city, busy in his absence, wore on its morning jars a borrowed blue, Along its necropolis, a few imported roses pretending charmingly to have grown there. The rites had not hardened into border. They behaved like fields after rain, accepting what arrives, absorbing to the depth allowed, then returning fruit that tastes of both clay and cloud. At his own lintel, he touched twice, set the coin upright and listened. Offshore, a hull with foreign lines ticked in the swell. In the lane, a torch moved with the calm emotion he trusted. And in the cool between house and night, where thresholds breathe, he felt the world, wider now, kinder for being wide, settle a little closer to his palm, as if far ahead a door he had never seen were already learning his knock. He began to notice how the old grammar kept speaking in places when no one thought they were telling ancient stories at all. The porchlight left burning like a household's small torch of escort, the key on a nail or the key card held to a censer with that deliberate, breath-long pause that reenacts the courtesy of asking to pass, the way people at hospital doors and airport gates still practice the art of almost touch. Fingers hovering a whisper from fingers in that tender space where love holds instead of clutching. In city cemeteries of marble and village plots, hemmed with rosemary, he saw coins glint on stone, little obols of gratitude from strangers and kin, and understood that the ferry, timetable or not, remains the world's most convincing metaphor for letting go. On certain calendar days, the country moved to old rhythms in new vestments, bowls of wheat, steamed and sweetened so that memory could be eaten. Candles ticked softly in churches where painted saints wore colours once belonging to fields and seasons. Names were spoken into rooms trained by centuries to listen. Across seas and languages, where other rites had put down roots, he noticed the same quiet insistences, a chair left empty, not to dramatise sorrow, but to admit that love keeps more seats than bodies. A winter hallway lit with a lane of lamps teaching hours how to find sleep. A wreath on a door because it is still a relief to declare that a threshold is more than wood. Museums, patient barns where time is stacked like hay, kept their own hush. Before a white-ground Lekathos whose pallor had outlasted 100 generations, Hermes looked no more spectral than any courteous friend. Beside it a fragment of stele preserved the familiar pose, head turned a little, hand almost touching, and school children, who giggled, at first grew quiet without knowing why. Scholars, gentle as gardeners, argued through glass about whether a painted oar had been corrected by another hand, or whether the wake was meant to fold rather than break. But the visitors, old men finding a bench, young lovers standing too close, understood the larger sentence. Every civilization writes its goodbye as carefully as its law. In a city apartment he watched a woman modern as steel and efficient as a harbour crane clear a ledge and place a photograph, a cup of water, a sprig of green. She named it nothing, a place to breathe beside a name, and the old country would have smiled and said it was exactly itself. Online, new necropolis rose from pixels and passwords. Candles flickered behind glass with a realism the ancients might have admired, and names were typed so algorithms could remember the pattern of their vowels. A philosopher of this century wondered whether the current carrying memory now is electric rather than riverine, and whether it matters. He decided the old counsel remains. Choose what you will forget, so life can move. Choose what you will remember, so it will still be life. He noticed dogs at thresholds in every district practicing the same art as their mythic cousin, with more heads than sense, watching, not snarling, keeping the in-betweens safe. He noticed porch rails where laurel had given way to basil or mint. Yet the air still cleaned itself on leaves. Pockets that collect coins no one quite spends, as if fingers like the proof that passage has been considered. In courts, oaths were taken, some on books, some on honour, and rooms, even with microphones and clocks, seemed to want a little Styx cold to edge their promises. Architects borrowed the Naiskos without naming it, door within a wall, pediment within a sky, and the public passed through those framed quiets as if something older than sound had nodded them onward. Therapists and grief counsellors, the Stoa of our era, rediscovered what keeners and washers always knew. Sorrow needs structure, breath has paces. Washing and folding and lighting are not superstition, but technologies of the heart. Some prescribed speaking a name aloud. Some assigned a letter to the dead. Some taught bodies to pause at thresholds so minds could catch up with the leaving. He liked how the old river names slid beneath modern talk, Lethe and Mnemosyne audible under the clinical words for avoidance and recall, and how choosing the cup remained the discipline, whether poured from a flask of chemical sleep or from the steady pitcher of practice. Even the counters of the uncountable admitted that communities with strong rites weather loss with fewer rips. The data, like a mosaic coming clean under dust, suggested that bread shared at the right hour has consequences as measurable as rain. In a quiet church, he read a later inscription and heard the earlier music beneath it. Blessed are those who remember, blessed are those who rest, blessed are those who return only in kindness. The names of Persephone and Demeter walked through cookbooks and gardens, pomegranates broken in kitchens that had never met a priest, seeds planted by children thinking only of colour, and the stairs between storerooms and field remained the secret architecture of 1,000 homes that count seasons while pretending not to. When storms pulled a power line down and the street went dark, neighbours came out with lamps that learned all over again to write commas in the air. Someone told a story about a grandmother's coin dish. Someone taught a child to say a name before the match ran out. And in that small emergency, the city rehearsed, without knowing the calm that thresholds ask. Travel widened the lesson. In Mexico, paper banners lifted like soft voices above altars, making home of absence. In Japan, a gate-framed emptiness so exactly the emptiness felt full. In a northern country, stones lay clean, and the grass did the remembering. Everywhere, the ferry changed silhouette and not its work. Everywhere the dog refused to bark. Historians still argue, kindly, how much of the old belief survives, whether a coin is habit, whether the wheat bowl is recipe, and he who had stood with potters and priests decided survival is sometimes nothing grander than a posture, a city lowering its voice at dusk, a household leaving space where silence can sit, a hand, your hand perhaps, finding a coin in the dark without surprise. Walking home through streets that know how to be gentle when lamps first bloom, he felt the next night gathering, the one for scholarly quarrels kept within courtesy, for scales and passwords and the ethics of gates, and in a pane of window he caught a moving torch, its flame a small perfect comma, pausing the sentence of the world, while at the edge of his door's shadow a patient dog lifted its head as if to say, the debate may proceed. He found, in the mellow hush that follows a long season of listening, a circle of scholars whose trade was care for questions. And the room, half stoa, half hearth, held its arguments the way a well-made cup holds wine, with room for air without spills. One began where everyone pretends there is nothing to quarrel with, old epic, and said the earliest songs leave us in a field of almost, shades thinned to a toneless persistence. Another, smiling but exact, answered that even there a few figures keep their colour, So the door stood ajar from the start for later brightenings. The ease of Elysium, the strictness of Tartarus, the meadows where memory walks. A third traced a stylus across wax and invoked Plato, for whom the soul is an exile remembering home by the discipline of thought. He drew a careful ladder, body to idea, habit to justice, ignorance to the slow burn of learning, until a historian of kitchens cleared her throat and reminded the room that whatever philosophers argue, cities eat and mourn by practice first. Washing, naming, coin, bread, metaphysics does not by itself set the table. Orphic gold lay next on the board, those lamellae like captive dawns folded small beside the dead. A textualist, tender to commas, wondered whether child of earth and starry sky promised a rare meadow to circles too small, while the broader city kept its moderate hope. A field worker, dust still in his hair, replied that promise is also medicine, and a culture that lets some imagine a brighter clearing may find that aspiration sweetens conduct without conscripting every throat to sing it. Someone, older, kindly, dry, asked whether the rivers were ever meant as rivers, and the room breathed a smile. An etymologist, who loves words the way sailors love currents, unfolded Styx as hatred sealed into oath, and Lethe as forgetting that can be mercy or neglect. Another mapped cold springs, whose taste villagers once called remembering. The consensus, if it deserved the name, was grown up. The rivers are truer than rocks, and not diminished by rocks that sound like them. The familiar quarrel about Tartarus set down its instruments, furnace or strict room. The poets, those who repair sense with refrain, favoured a chamber where law puts back what hubris tore. The jurists nodded, preferring correction to spectacle. A mason's voice, practical from the back bench, added that any society that turns its below into theatre soon drags cruelty upstairs. A second quarrel arrived with equally clean hands. Does a life repeat? A Pythagorean descendant traced a patient circle, murmuring that return is kindness to learning. A farmer's son, friendly to meadows, said one good season suffices if you sow as if watched by spring. The room decided, in that unspoken way rooms do, to let both metaphors keep their chairs. Archaeology supplied its gentle frictions. A white cremation urn argued 1 century's taste. A hill of inhumations, a stroll away, showed another age's patience with time. A reader of fragments, who takes pottery the way some take diaries, reminded them that coins under tongues are common but not universal, and that within a single polis habits braid more than they march. What truly happened at Eleusis? The seasoned room, pious in its secular way, laughed softly as at a child's hand moving toward flame. We do not know. We know enough to be faithful to not knowing. Torches, a kernel, feet learning that a door is not a wall. Then a silence that keeps dignity precisely because it refuses to become anecdote. The necromantian came up, temple, theatre, or both, and a traveller reported a discipline of abstinence, precision, a single clean question allowed to stand without bullying it into answers by fear. The dog at the gate received his share, why so rarely carved with snarl? And a sculptor said guardianship is more trustworthy than menace. That watchfulness is better company for thresholds than threat. Even Kerberos, multiplied by the storyteller's delight, keeps his mouths closed on most vases. The lesson being that keeping is quieter than catching. In a corner, a philosopher of mourning proposed that the scale below weighs attachments, not tallies. Across from him, a woman, who has washed more bodies than anyone wished to count, said the scale must learn to weigh the living too, since grieving nobly is the last gift we give the dead. The philosopher folded his hands as if corrected by a kinder teacher than argument. The talk returned, like water to its bed, to the almost touch carved on so many stones. A classicist called it a code of manners, love stopping a breath shy, so leaving can keep its poise. A theologian without doctrine called it pedagogy, practicing release before being made to. A young student, eyes tired with new seeing, called it mercy, an image that spares the living the insult of erasure. They agreed on very little and almost everything, on thresholds as fruitful ways of thinking, on the danger of turning maps into weapons, on rituals long patience as an education in courage. When the lamps inclined themselves towards sleep, the last voice named the misconceptions that creep into any weather of belief, grand spectacles that drown grief in fire, tired laughs about coins as superstition without noticing the courtesy they perpetuate, lazy confusions of fear with reverence, law with love. He walked home, with pockets heavier for having carried so many careful disagreements, and felt in himself a courteous desire to set certain errors right, not by scolding, but by reteaching the pace of a procession, the salt of a name on bread, the difference between forgetting that heals and forgetting that denies. And at his door, the laurel breathed its clean breath. On the table, the coin held a moon's light. A dog, feigning stillness, watched the seam between corridor and night. He stood in that seam, thinking how easily people misread what was meant as kindness, and far off, as if to invite a gentler correction, a file of torches moved along the ridge like punctuation, searching for the softest sentence with which to end the day. He saw, as seasons turned and the city learned to hold its own history more tenderly, that certain errors kept casting long, clumsy shadows at the threshold, and he set himself the mild work of smoothing them, like a palm easing a sheet before a sleeper lies down. First, the loudest, that below is chiefly a furnace for enemies, a theatre of punishment that flatters the living with rage. He would guide a visitor, by voice, not hand, to a stele where two fingers hover a breath apart and say, here the Greek grammar is poise, not spectacle. Tartarus, in its oldest tone, is not a stadium of cruelty, but a strict room where law quietly unbends what hubris twisted. The judges are auditors, weighing attachments, what we clutch too hard, what we refuse to lift, so that civic courage does not curdle into vengeance. Second, the coin. Mocked as a quaint brass button on grief's mouth it is, he'd murmur, simply manners. He would set a dish down, stand a small piece of silver upright, and let the room notice its steadiness. Not magic, a promise, readiness for passage, debt acknowledged, hospitality extended to a ferryman whose face is stern because fairness needs a face. Third, the rivers. Hurry calls them decorations, or literalities to be outgrown. He would speak their names softly. Acheron's fog, Cocytus's licensed weeping, Phlegethon's dry crackle of regret, Styx's oath cold, Lethe's soft eraser, and remind that they run inside us as surely as under us. Each day we choose, forgetting that lets life move, and remembering that keeps it true. Fourth, the mysteries taken as gossip with better lighting. He would point to the torch's comma motion and to the seed. Instruction there was choreography, not titillation, feet learning descent, so fear does not teach at first, a body taught that doors can be persuaded by poise. Fifth, the dog. Later, minds sharpen his teeth. Older craft keeps his mouths closed. Guardian, not hunter. Watchfulness, not appetite. Thresholds policed by menace become prisons. Those kept by attention become safe. Sixth, the queen. Retellings leave her a captive and stop. He would recall the counted seeds and storerooms under her lamp, months below as stewardship, months above as grace. Fields breathe by her calendar. 7th, the belief that grief must be loud to be true. In lanes where laws, set measures, and old women measured breath, he had seen sorrow take a shape that does not drown the street. Washing done cleanly, bread shared, names spoken, quiet restored. When keening rises, it is scaffolding, not a storm. Its discipline is the mercy. 8th, Orphic leaves misread as velvet rope tickets. He would unfold a phrase, thin as sunlight, child of earth and starry sky, and show how aspiration, even if held by a few, becomes medicine for many. The remembered spring teaches a city to choose memory more often, to drink accountability like cool water rather than dread it. 9th, cremation versus burial treated as creeds at war. Soil and jars say otherwise. One age is ash, another's earth, both folded into the same courtesy. The choice is rhythm, not quarrel. 10th, myth taken as ledger or as ornament. Better to hear it as weather. It doesn't count, it brings rain. Orpheus warns tenderness to practice trust until the last step. Achilles asks glory to retune itself toward daylight among field hands. Heracles reminds strength that obedience is the leash that passes gates without quarrel. 11th, the foreign cousins dismissed as rivals. Egypt's green forever, italic gates with ushers stern. The ships taught another tone. Kin recognizes kin across water. Different bridges span the same gulf. Different feasts feed the same hunger for continuance, repair, and a justice that wakes without shouting. 12th, a modern habit that keeps the tools but discards the sense. Porch lamps lit without knowing they escort. Keys tapped to senses without the pause of permission. Coins gathered in bowls but never given the dignity of being chosen. He offered attention. See what your hands already know? The right breathes beneath your speed. 13th, the fear that ritual manipulates. In kitchens and under laurel, he had watched structure rescue, feeling from chaos. A measured cup, a folded cloth, an hour guarded by fire. These do not coerce grief. They cradle it until it can stand. 14th, zeal that wants the underworld to enforce our politics. He would smile and set down bread. No threats at supper. The dead are not our cudgels. 15th, the smallest and therefore keenest, that the almost touch on stone is indifference. He would hold his hand a breath from another's and keep the breath long enough for the room to feel its mercy. Love holds, then lets, and the living, taught so, go home lighter and more loyal. He did not preach, he adjusted, a coin polished, laurel freshened, a name pronounced with its music restored, and when the city slipped back into its old mistakes, as cities do, he walked the necropolis lane until the discipline of carved drapery and patient dogs returned his ear to the right pitch. Beyond the orchards, a file of torches moved, like punctuation through the dark, and the sentence of the world softened toward truth again, while at his own lintel the key waited, cool under his fingers, and the door breathed once, as doors do, before yielding. He began to notice how the old river kept flowing through newer channels, film reels whispering in dark rooms, pages turning under bedside lamps, murals arriving on blank city walls, so that the Greek afterlife, once walked by torchlight, learned the grammar of electric glow without losing its poise. On screens, a boat returned again and again, sometimes a skiff nosing into fog, sometimes a subway car easing into an unmarked station, sometimes only the reflection of a bridge turned upside down at night, the oar stroke translated into edits, the ferry's patience into a long take that refuses to hurry the leaving. Directors who had never studied the rivers still found the lullaby of thresholds, a door opening slow, a hand stopping a breath from touch, a dog at the edge of frame watching the scene as if the scene were a guest. In theatres, the ancient house of masks took contemporary faces. A chorus in street clothes learned grief's pace, inhaling together before a lament so the air could carry it without tearing. Persephone appeared as a woman in a winter coat at the top of municipal stairs, seeds clacking like coins in her pocket, and the city understood at once that spring would need earning again. Somewhere, a composer folded the river names into a score, 5 notes recurring like weather, and the audience, not knowing why, felt their breath fall into a rhythm kind to thresholds. Poets, ferrymen of syllables, kept polishing the old coin until it flashed on new tongues. A plane of asphodel reimagined as an airport lounge where time resigns its authority. Kerberos given a single, unbarking muzzle, set under a desk lamp to guard a shoebox of letters. Styx turned into a kitchen vow, palm on wood, sworn so quietly truth need not raise its voice. Children's books, where mercy often rehearses first, drew the underworld in colours that did not frighten, a key big enough for small hands to understand permission, a torch whose flame befriends the dark it enters, a queen in a green dress with pockets deep as seasons. In comic panels, the judges sat at a card table beneath a streetlight, weighing not lives but lunches. The joke, gentle, almost affectionate, taught without insisting that judgment, at its best, is attention. In galleries, white ground lekitoi stood like calm witnesses, while contemporary vessels answered across the room. Tall bottles smoked with soot, glazed the colour of winter morning, painted with almost touching hands, and dogs with professional patience. A photographer made a series of doors that open onto nothing. Viewers lingered, reading their own names into the handle. A choreographer taught dancers to cross a stage like a ferry. No leaps, only steps, each footfall set as if the floor remembered. Even the skeptical arts, which clear their throats at piety, borrowed the shapes of kindness. A satirist arranged a row of subway turnstiles and titled it Styx, inviting a laugh and then the noticing that we still lower our voices as we pass. In pop songs, the Queen became a girl from the north who disappears each November and returns with the thaw. The ferryman became a cab driver who never speaks first and never drives too fast. The coin became one bright syllable saved for the chorus, spent once exactly where it changes the night. Video games, busy cities of pixels, placed gates at map edges, and leashed monsters with manners. The mechanic of return became a parable of return, and somewhere a player learned, without naming it, to carry memory across attempts the way an Orphic traveller carries a folded password. In school corridors, teachers without priestly air taught the mysteries by choreography. Lights down, a small lamp cupped, a passage read about seeds, 1 minute with no grade taken. Afterward, hands moved more carefully around desks, as if the room had practiced letting and receiving. The old misunderstandings wandered here too and met gentler insistence. When spectacle tried to sharpen Tartarus into tourist cruelty, a quiet film answered with a room of scales and a hush fit for auditors. When commerce tempted the coin toward kitsch, a poet set one on a lover's tongue and made it mean promise rather than purchase. When fear wanted the dog to snarl, an animator drew him blinking slowly. And children, who trust thresholds better than adults, blinked back. Museums mounted exhibitions where import and inheritance could sit without quarrel, Egyptian fields of green beside Greek meadows of ease, Roman columbaria lit like streets. Visitors moved at the lyric pace of glass cases and learned that cousins across water bow to one another in a family of rites. He liked most the uncurated sightings, a laurel sprig taped to an apartment door in winter, ladder-shaped cookies cooling on a bakery rack, their sugared rungs like frost, a chair left empty at a wedding to honour the unarrived, the way a neighbourhood, when the power fails, discovers that lanterns still write commas in the dark and stories still choose the same old roads. In such appearances, the underworld shed its antique and kept its honesty. Not a museum piece, but a method for walking the hour, a way modern hands carry the day without dropping the names that built it. He kept a small archive of these, folded ticket from a ferry that never said its name, postcard of a painted door, a dog-eared page where a novelist let the afterlife be a long field of listening. And these scraps, turned over at his table, felt like the contemporary city's contribution to the old ledger. For all the medium's noise, the best of them kept a human tempo, breath-length lines, edits that behaved like oars, colours that understood winter without scolding it. And as the evening drifted toward its tender hour, he felt that whatever came last, if there must be a last, should not be argument or flourish, but gratitude. Shutters closed softly, a coin left where morning will find it, a lamp showing how not to hurry, a dog, professional and kind, pretending to sleep at the hinge where hall and night consider each other, while far beyond the roofs the river rehearsed its old names in a voice low enough to dream by, and somewhere a seed counted softly, preparing the step that carries winter into spring. He chose to end the long keeping of this story on one of those tender evenings when windows breathe a little and roofs remember rain. He stood the coin upright in its dish until it held a moon's light without trembling, touched the laurel at the door, a small green prayer, and let the rooms take their cue from his unhurried step. Out in the lane, a dog practiced the profession of thresholds by watching nothing in particular. Far off, a single torch moved with that calm motion he had trusted for years, pausing the sentence of the world so feeling could arrive whole. He let his mind gather what had gathered here. The potter's lamp pale lekitoi, where Hermes keeps one respectful pace behind. The stone-cutter's relief, where fingers halt a breath from touch. The old women who know which oil answers which rash. The baker, shaping little ladders for visiting feet, the lamella thin as kept sunlight, teaching a traveller to ask for the cool spring of remembering. He counted again the 5 rivers that turned out also to be 5 rooms of the heart. Acheron's fog, where sorrow learns legibility. Cocytus, a lawful road for grief. Phlegethon, the dry flicker of regret that warms but should not devour. Styx, the cold clarity of a kept vow. Lethe, the mercy that sands an edge, and when chosen well, makes morning possible. He remembered Eleusis and its choreography no tongue was meant to own. Torch, seed, dark, return, and the fields that take instruction from a queen stepping softly beneath us. 6 for winter, then green. He smiled at the way the city had argued without breaking, philosophers with clean hands, and mothers dusted in flour, over whether judgment is ledgers or loves, and how the lanes decided by practice. Wash, name, bread, quiet, let the dead be guests of honour, and teach the living not to frighten themselves with zeal. He thought gratefully of the mercies that came from other coasts, reed fields and feather scales, stern gates with winged attendants, and how the ferry learned new silhouettes without altering the honest angle of its oar. He recalled the newer grammars that proved the old river alive inside modern wire and breath, porch lights as torches of escort, keys held to censors with a brief permission pause, coins glinting on city stones, museum glass keeping a calm over painted boats whose wakes fold rather than break. Around these lay the patient quarrels lined up like books, the thinness of Homer's shades and the colour that seeps back in later singing, the severity of oaths and the courage that prefers correction over spectacle, the quiet suspicion that myths are weather, not statute bringing rain to whatever we have sown. Most of all, he felt the small technologies of kindness, those tools with handles for the dark, still at their work, a linen fold instructing respect, a wick tuned to survive a gusty corner, a beer balance to sway like rocking, rather than risk a farewell that blesses as it lets go. He stood in his doorway, where hallway and night consult each other, and for a moment raised his hand above the table, a breath from another's, the gesture stele after stele has kept with such tact. In that held breath he heard again the pedagogy of thresholds. Love holds, then lets, and in the letting the road both ways is kept clear. If there are judges, may they be auditors of tenderness. If there is a plain, let it be a field where labour is perfected into ease. If there is a strict room for crooked deeds, let it be a workshop where the bent is heated and set true. If there is return, let it bring steadier posture to old loves. And if there is only this, bread, names, and the right degree of quiet, already we are in mercy. He turned once more to the coin, remembering it is not magic, but manners. To the laurel, which keeps its breath winter and summer. To the dog, who blinked a professional blink, as if to say, you have learned the gate's language, you may pass. Beyond the roofs, the river rehearsed its low syllables. Above them, the stars pinned their patient points to a fabric older than any thesis. Between the two, where mortals live, the city lowered its voice as a good host does after midnight, and the hour became easy to walk. If you have come this far, lamp by lamp, seed by seed, thank you for your company. Thank you for letting old courtesies take their time along your breathing, for setting a chair where a name needed it, for letting the dog rest while you listened. May your thresholds be watched by kindness, and your promises keep a little of Styx's cool. May your forgetting be gentle, and your remembering bright. May a small coin wait where your hand can find it in the dark. And when the world asks you, as it will, to practice the art of almost touch, may you feel under your fingers the city's long education in love. Now the shutters can close softly. Torches can go on writing commas in the night without us. The river knows its work. Somewhere a seed is counting, and somewhere a gate, good-mannered, unafraid, breathes once and opens.